Wow. All right. Well, welcome everyone. It's so nice to see your little faces on my screen. I'm just thrilled to see some of you. I'm Jessica Pressman. I'm Associate Professor of English and Comparative Literature at San Diego State, and I am co-founder and currently co-director of the Digital Humanities Initiative here with Dr. Pam Lack. And we're so thrilled to welcome you to the first of our book talks for the spring semester with my dear friend and dear friend to the Digital Humanities Initiative, Mark Marino. And if you joined us last semester, you'll know that what we do for these book talks, well, let me just say, the reason for these book talks, the reason for focusing on book talks in the time of COVID and Zoom is because we want to celebrate the work of our great friends and colleagues. And this is a really wonderful and easy way to do it, right? As we all work in isolation sometimes for years, decades on our scholarship. And usually it comes out and we're able to meet in person, have a drink or coffee and celebrate, but we can't do that right now. And Mark's book came out last year. And those of you in the field of new media studies, broadly construed, know it's a really important book. And we haven't had a chance to gather and share and celebrate. So today is an opportunity to hear about the book, hear from Mark, ask questions, and gather virtually as well. Okay, so Mark will talk, I hope, for about 20, 30 minutes, right, Mark? And then we'll open it to conversation, to Q&A, and we're gonna keep the chat open. So please feel free to say hi to your friends and ask questions. I will, Mark won't be looking at the chat, I don't think, but I will, and I'll try and collect them for later on. So let me give a kind of formal introduction to those of you who don't know Mark Marino. If you have been at San Diego State for the last 5 years or so, you do know Mark because he's come to do electronic literature workshops, to be a supportive voice and friend of the digital humanities. He's been a juror on our electronic literature student competition for the last few years. So he's really been a friend to this initiative. But Mark is a writer and scholar of digital literature who teaches at the University of Southern California, where he's professor of teaching. He's director of communication for the Electronic Literature Organization. I see a bunch of ELO folks. It's so nice to see you all. In terms of books, print books, he's one of 10 co-authors of 10 Print, and I see Nick there as well, another of the co-authors. He's a co-author with me and Jeremy Douglas of Reading Project, collaborative analysis of Poundstone's Tachistoscope. And this book, Critical Code Studies, came out last year from MIT. And it is, we've been waiting for this book for a while, I'll say. The first inkling, and we'll talk about this in Q&A, of critical code studies, which Mark coined the term and introduced this pioneering perspective, was in 2006 in the Electronic Book Review. That essay, which I teach every time I teach an electronic literature class, I teach that essay. And we've been waiting for this book, this monograph, to introduce critical code studies and show us how to do it and why it matters. So we're thrilled to be able to launch that today. And I also just want to share one other work that's really meaningful of Mark's is the Mrs. Wobbles stories, which he writes with his children, which are just, we'll put in some of the links in a moment, but they're wonderful interactive fiction for children. So no further ado, let me welcome one of my dearest friends, Mark Marino.
Well, thank you, Jessica, and thank you, Pam, for organizing this and inviting me, and thank you all for coming. It's overwhelming to me to see all of your faces and to see names of friends and colleagues and collaborators and some folks that I've only interacted with through the Critical Code Studies working groups and folks I know from other quarters as well. So thank you all for taking time out of your busy days for yet another Zoom session. I know we can get Zoom overwhelmed sometimes, so, and I do as well. So I appreciate especially that. And also hi to folks who are watching the recording after the fact. And so many of you that I owe tremendous debts of gratitude. And again, the acknowledgements of the book go on quite extensively about this. And if I began naming names now, I would certainly leave people out. So I apologize. Maybe a special thanks though to Doug Sari. I don't know if he was able to come today. He was thinking of dropping by. somewhat formerly of MIT Press, but without whom this book would certainly not be in existence. And of course, Noah and the whole team of the software studies series that helped make this book happen. And again, many of you did as well. So I'm just gonna hop around from a few topics. Jessica asked if I would focus this a little bit more on maybe what critical code studies has to say about electronic literature, but since we'll do like a brief high-level overview, and then maybe I'll speak to that for just a few minutes. And maybe the most important thing to think about in regard to that is that it's curious that there is a difference between electronic literature that was written before there was something called critical code studies and something after it. And even when I mean after it, so the essay was written in 2006, that one that Jessica mentioned. And the original impetus was that I was studying chatbots for my dissertation at UC Riverside. And I came across Kate Hales's essay in Writing Machines, or her writing, where she says there should be medium-specific analysis of digital objects that we look at. And I asked myself, what did that mean? And while platform studies with Nick and software studies was emerging, I thought, well, for me, for some of these chatbots, and again, these weren't AI chatbots, they were chatbots of the variety of the ELIZA variety. If you wrote something and they said something back as kind of, conditional relationships and triggers. And I thought, well, you got to say something about the code. And then how do you do this? And so I went to all my mentors and I said, how do you do this? And they said, okay, well, look here at Los Pequeños Glacier, look at Florian Kramer, look at what Alan Liu's doing. But there weren't anybody who was doing like extensive readings of code and what that meant. But I had been told from my semiotics courses, and I've been told from my close reading, cultural analysis, and literary studies that we should be able to say things about any of these science systems. But the question is, like, how do you say it, and what feels like it's meaningful and what feels like it's not meaningful? So I think maybe a lot of the 10 years in between, or 15 years in between that first idea and the book, are me finding out slowly but surely, one way or the other, what feels like we can meaningfully say about code, and maybe things that people feel like are arbitrary impositions on code. And again, if anybody's embarking in this realm, which is still so nascent, like don't be afraid. But maybe it also helps if we just from the get-go say that even though what we're doing feels and is archaeological and anthropological, that really I think it's just at the same time poetic and interpretive. And it's just as much, it'll feel like a discovery, but it's probably a creation, right? You think you're finding the meaning, but you're making the meaning at that point. And I think that's okay, especially when we get into the realm of literary study. And I just want to make one distinction, which is, I think the thing that makes, I'm always careful about talking about digital literature by using critical code studies, because my fear is that the people out there, when they hear that, they'll say, oh yeah, well, that's because you can only interpret the source code of digital art objects. Like those are the only things that should be interpreted because those are made by artists with intentionality. And so a lot of my work has been to try to offer people other examples so that they don't limit the study to that. And certainly examples like, 10 print, we got some 10 print authors in the house. And then maybe some of the other examples that we have in the book, whether it's Kittler's code or if it's code from Flowmatic, from Grace Hopper. These are all code objects that are not made for aesthetic reasons. And so interpreting them, again, it's more like cultural studies work, I guess, at that level. But hopefully those examples make the case that it's possible, and maybe even something we should desirable to interpret the code of objects that are not made for aesthetic reasons. That said, when you do look at the source code for aesthetic objects, I feel like the pleasures multiply, right? Because here we have these people whose their specialty is semiotic meaning making. Like that's what they're good at. That's what they're setting out to do to begin with. They're working with data and processes to make something meaningful to other people. And so when we get to interact with them as readers of that code, obviously there are lots of ways in which I don't know, pleasures abound. And part of that, again, has been made. Everything changes though once you know that there are these people who are going to be potentially reading your code. And it's probably good to first just state that, why does source code exist? I think a lot of people would say it exists so we can tell machines what to do. But as far as I can tell, on the deepest level, source code exists so that humans can speak to themselves about what they're telling the machines to do. Because otherwise, potentially we could do a lot of what we do, at least with low level code, we could do on a purely electronic level, circuits and things like that, things that my wife teaches electrical engineering. So certainly that realm, we could just sort of take care of things that way. But we find that we've got these complex operations that we've got to keep track of, and we've got to communicate to other people. And so we've got code as a medium that's for machines, but for communicating to humans with and through machines. So, okay, so if we have so if we've at least taken that off, that code is not math, I guess, and maybe just get that out of the way. Code is not, and maybe math isn't math, in that, at some point, I think I thought of code as like switching on light switches, well, how could you interpret a light switch? The lights either turn it on or off. But again, once you open your mind to the sheer semiotic possibility of code, for any operation you're trying to do. So once code becomes almost as wide as any linguistic operation, you have this tremendous set of possibilities as to what the person could or could not write. Then you get to bring all your other tools you bring into interpreting any kind of semiotic expression, and maybe a few more. So I just for a second want to point out maybe a few objects of study that are fun to think about once you have something called critical code studies, or any kind of code studies, I guess, for that matter. Whether like Kevin Brock introduces this term of rhetorical code studies, or Ruha Benjamin has this thing that she's calling race critical code studies. And so, again, so whatever you want to call our code studies that we're doing here. And again, I'm going to share screen for a second and just show you some objects of study, sort of walk you through. It's really just going to be a bunch of different pages we look at very, very briefly. So again, just a little plug for a moment that every 2 years, the HACS Lab, the Humanities and Critical Code Studies Lab, sponsors something called the Critical Code Studies Working Group. And I just want to invite all of the people who've assembled here. Some of you have already been long participants of this. This biennial event allows us a chance to gather people online and to try to do some new work. And often we have topics for weekly discussions, and then we allow people to post code studies threads. And really a lot of the most interesting work in the field happens or starts or continues at these events, including Tenprint, which grew out of our first working group. So I want to invite you all to those. And now let me just walk you through a few things that may be of interest. First of all, there's a book site or really a site for all critical code studies, just at criticalcodestudies.com, where you'll find links to our reading list that we keep in Zotero, and we've got our working group, some book links, and of course the HACS Lab, which I run at USC. And then also for each of the code objects that are in the book, like the Transporter Immigrant tool developed by the Electronic Disturbance Theater 2, that used to be entirely housed at UC San Diego, but now it's well, almost entirely housed there, but is spread across the country currently. And so you'll find their code, you'll find some other objects, maybe how it works, and then you'll find links to other things that might help you understand the code. And really the book itself owes a debt of gratitude to reviewer number 2 of the first version of it. That was when I submitted to MIT Press in 2010, where it was rejected, who said, maybe you should reorganize the book around big chunks of code that get analyzed. Much like there was another book about programming that was organized in this way. And so each chapter of Critical Code Studies, if you haven't read it yet, begins with a large passage of code that's annotated and that leads to the discussion of that code and hopefully a clear explanation of what it does. So here's the Transcoder Immigrant tool. And then here's a scalar book that I wrote, you'll find linked to it, about the same, about the code of that. And that has various resources, including interviews with the folks who were there. And I bring up this example from the Transcoder Immigrant tool because it has one of the most obvious uses of critical code studies. It has a function in it, a method that talks about witching events. And these witching events take this, first of all, the Transcoder Immigrant tool in brief, an art project that is designed to lead people, help people when they've crossed a border, could be any border, but often the Mexico-US border, in their last mile of survival. And it uses GPS, but it also guides them through poetry, much of it which has been written by Amy Sarah Carroll, part of the EDD2. But in the code, there's this method. And the method talks about witching events. And when I looked at this code and found this witching event, you can see it right here, I was, partially astounded because here's this high-tech tool that uses GPS and all these other things. And it's using this method named for a folk practice of, if you don't know what water witching is, it's the same notion of water divining. So you take a wooden stick and that wooden stick will lead you to water, I guess, because sticks are still close to water. I don't know the whole thinking behind it or the whole reasoning, but that sticks know where water is. And this is a conceptual metaphor in the code. So I think this is an easy example of critical code studies, just finding something that is named in the code that's worth elaborating, worth reflecting on further. Okay, so that may be like an easy example. Also, we've got other poets like Nick and Stephanie Strickland, who created C and Spar Between, who've released their code. Not only have they released their code, I mean, it was sort of already public, but more importantly, they've annotated a version of their code for reading by folks who want to reflect. This is C and Spar Between is a poetry generator, combining lines from Herman Melville and Emily Dickinson, and generated in this poetry generator that sort of spreads them out on an infinite sea. But here we've got Nick and Stephanie have sort of done some work for us, or they've helped us through to navigate their code and to think about it by not commenting like good programmers should do, but also inviting us. And this was first published in Digital Humanities Quarterly in a special issue that Jessica was a co-editor of. And so this is something that's out there in the world that literary scholars can grab hold of. I also want to call your attention to other sorts of things. So we've got the fascinating work of John Corbett, who's creating a Cree programming language. And I think he's changed the name of this recently, but here it is featured in one of our most recent working groups. And this is a programming language, for the sort of preserve some cultural knowledge of the Métis people, of whom he's a member of that tribe, and to preserve some of the Cree language. And then he talks about developing these programming structures out of cultural constructs of the Métis people, right? So again, this is another rich piece, a rich cultural object that is being developed, where someone is thinking about programming as an expressive space for culture on the deepest programming level. I mean, I'm not saying deepest like down to assembly language, but on the level of constructing the language itself. So it's not just using the language to express ideas of culture, but it's building a language to preserve the culture and transmit the culture. Anyway, that's another maybe literary application of critical code studies, is to explore this with him. And he explores it with us because he's part of this community as well. Let's see if I have any other ones I want to show you right now. Maybe I'll use those as the examples right away. And then I do want to show you one other thing that's grown out of this whole enterprise that, again, might feel a little bit like maybe serving up another entry point for people as they think about critical code studies in terms of our literary pursuits. And of course, since I'm somebody who tries to do both things, I had this little piece that I was published in New River last year. And this is a work of interactive fiction that exists in a Google Collaboratory notebook. And that Google Collaboratory sort of hosts online a Jupyter notebook. And a Jupyter notebook is a digital space that allows us to have code that runs. So this is a story about someone who is in the position of a code monkey. They have to maintain the code for it takes place in a dystopian future alternate reality where many have been conscribed to be sort of, code monkeys or servants to the larger AI, nefarious AI that cannot, it cannot fix its own code. So it's kind of a Shabbat Goyim, I guess, this person who's there to like turn on the lights and fix the code for it. And then your job as you're reading the story is to make changes to the code, to make corrections to it. And I'm just going to show you really quickly how that works. First, I need to make a copy of this, because otherwise I would be changing the one that everybody reads when they read it, which would not be very nice for me to do. Could cause other problems for me. And then I'll show you. So we're going to go down and we'll see this passage of code and we can run it. We can see what it does. And hopefully this will happen in some, and there it goes. It says go on to the next step. Okay, and then we can read more of the story if we wish. And we get our next task of what we're supposed to do. Let's see what the task is. It says change this line to hello system. So we're going to go to the line that says respond 1. Okay. And I'm going to change that to, hopefully I will do this correctly. I might not. Hello system, of course, playing off of the like hello world first programming that a lot of people write. Press the play button and let's see what happens. This is going to break, isn't it? I've already done my hello system. There it goes. Anyway, you continue to read the story and change the code as you go. And I'm not being a spoiler to point out that as you're reading the story, you tend to question these changes you're making to the code and whether you're doing something that's going to help the humanity in particular, or if it's going to hurt them. And then you also are contacted by some sort of enemy, some rebel group, the resistance, that wants you to change the code in a different way. Now, I do believe we can read all sorts of code, but this is another example of code that has been brought into a literary context with, or at least a narrative context, with the idea of opening up a new space for you to explore and interpret. All right, Jessica, I promised you I'd keep it relatively short. So there's like a great big overview of some of the ways that critical code studies speaks to code, but also maybe like a nice little overview of things. So take it away. Where should we go next, Jessica?
That was great, Mark. Well, I would love to invite, we have a really diverse group of folks here today, and I'd love to invite them to ask questions. But can I ask you, Mark, for some of the grad students that are here and people that are just tuning in to learning about Elit and critical code studies, can you just kind of simply tell us what you see as the innovation of critical code studies for literary studies or for humanities work?
So I don't know if it innovates or not. I won't go that far, but I will say that the goal of critical code studies is to open up another semiotic realm for close reading interpretation of whatever kind you prefer to do. And to encourage the critical dimension, for me, has always been to encourage people to intentionally apply critical theory in that interpretation. again, whatever lenses you find to be most productive. But in other words, while I think it is possible to talk about code in a way that feels like, I don't know, technological history, I guess, or I don't know. Maybe I'll leave it at that. So there's a way in which I think people try to think they could maybe only talk about it in a neutral or descriptive way. And instead to say that obscures the fact that when we talk about even code, we are already applying ideological and theoretical lenses to it. And so let's just be more explicit and intentional about that and see how meaning emerges from that code that speaks back to the aesthetic object or whatever object we're interpreting. So I guess the biggest thing would be that it's opening up this space as a place where, and I guess maybe another thing I would really say, if I could, and hopefully this doesn't come across as too cheesy or idealistic, is to encourage people to realize that the skill set that they've been trained in, all of these theoretical interpretive abilities have a value that is equal to the value that is placed on those who can and do program professionally. So our capitalist system will devalue it, and your parents and family members will devalue it when when you say you're a literary student of literature rather than a professional programmer. Of course, professional programmers know that may not be all that glamorous either. But instead to celebrate the set of interpretive tools that you've been trained to use and to value them, and to realize that the really crucial importance of you having those conversations with those programmers I think like companies are starting to wake up, right? Even in, and maybe especially in our Black Lives Matter moment, you know what I mean? And they're taking groups like the Algorithmic Justice League or other similar projects, or the work of Sophia Noble, and they're saying, hey, we need to start having conversations with people be outside the technical and engineering team to think about how this thing is being developed too. But more importantly, it's really just to validate and authorize and to maybe encourage those of you who have those abilities to interpret, and to say our society, in my mind, would benefit from your intervention in technological development, and you intervening by looking into these pieces of code and how they're being developed and where they're, and what they're doing, right? As opposed to black boxing everything, you know what I mean? Which is a way that probably larger systems like to keep us compliant, perhaps.
That's great, Mark. Thank you. Okay, we have a great question from Jacob here. He says, you gave some examples of bringing literary studies to code. Can you name a way one might bring code to literary studies? In other words, how would you go about discussing code, which isn't explicitly intentionally literary, to make meaning as opposed to finding it? Is there a distinction I'm adding on to between literary code and regular code? Is there a way that this goes back and forth?
Yeah. Well, yeah, I think it's the easiest way in there. Well, there are two ways to do it. So the easiest way is to, bring code from those like Perl poetry competitions and things like that, where people have written, or maybe even like the work of Margaret Ree and other code poets. You can bring in code objects or code adjacent objects that are explicitly written to be read, and talk about that in a literary context. What I was just doing with the first year seminar that I teach at USC was we were looking at the code of stochastic text that Nick adapted, and also House of Dust that Zach Whalen re-implemented. And we were looking at those processes and how of those poetry generators, and then talking about them in a longer literary tradition from the Oulipo, from the Surrealists, from the Dadaists that they come from. And so to help them understand code not as a brand new object of study, but as part of a longer literary tradition and heritage, and really to seize upon this moment where process becomes the poetry, and then to show how various artists have tried to then tackle that.
That's wonderful. So seeing it in a longer continuum. Can I ask you a question then also about the historical context of your own work, which is the first piece on critical code studies came out in 2006 in Electronic Book Review. And I wonder if you think that things are different in terms of the field as this book comes out now. I mean, even you and I were grad students in the field of new media studies, and now we're hosting you in digital humanities, right? So wondering how if you see any difference in the last 15 years in the kinds of conversations or contexts in which your work operates.
So yes and no. Like I said, on the one hand, I don't feel like I have to make the initial case. I don't feel like I have to make as hard as I used to. Like you used to be, there was a lot of, what do you mean by this? Are you reading? Does that mean you're going to read my? I talked to a programmer. Are you going to read my code like I'm some Shakespeare out there? Or please don't read my code. There's nothing there. You're not going to find out that I'm a racist or whatever. Whatever people. Code programmers, professional programmers feel a lot of shame about their code, and the idea that I would come in trouncing in and poke around in it was unpleasant to them for a long time. But anyway, I don't feel like I have to make that argument as hard as I used to. We definitely have more people out there, more artists who are conscious of the fact that their code could be read as part of the interpretation. I mean, even the Transporter Immigrant tool, the code for that was released at a critical code studies event. So there was a sense, that audience exists. And now also there are many more outlets like, Taper, Nick's magazine, and others that encourage people to be creative with code and to publish it. And also there was a really fabulous new book that just came out. I don't have it here with me that I would have loved to plugged if it were handier. About, and maybe someone can put it in the chat, about code as an artistic medium. Okay, so there's that side of it. On the other side of it, there's a weird thing that has happened, a predictable thing. Let me just be frank. From my point of view, the code is the hardest thing to interpret in a digital object. There may be harder things when it comes to hardware, but for most of these software objects, the code is the layer that people, if someone can put off talking about the code, they will. If they can just quote a couple lines of code and just leave it, call it a day, they will. And so with some of the algorithmic talk, you'll notice there are things about, like, there's a lot of popularity of talking about algorithmic accountability and things like that. And some of that is in that people also don't talk about code, often because they don't have access to it. But, like we don't have access to Google's code, but, we can sort of test to see how Google works. Okay. So from my point of view, as someone who's on this weird zealot's mission, like I'm this missionary trying to convince people that, people should be looking at the code. From my point of view, that algorithmic argument, while important, I guess there's a part of me that still wants to see what people can do with code. Like, I feel like even though the idea has been out there now for 14 years, we still haven't even begun to figure out, even the initial set of things we could say about code. So I guess my book, I don't know. I still see the book as offering some initial examples of the way one person would do this in the hopes that other people will figure out how to do it even better, So strangely, part of it has become easier, and part of it just shows me just how hard it is, or how maybe even how scary it is, you know.
We have some really great questions in the chat, Mark. We're gonna want to save these for you for later. Let me just pick up one from Samara, which is a question of the political implications, saying that expressing an enjoyment of your chapter on ClimateGate and asking if you could talk a little more on the political implications of critical code studies. Does the reading of code strengthen, or could it strengthen our democracy or even our ability to be good readers, public citizens?
Yeah, I really think so. So thanks for that question, Haley. Great to see you. You know, there are systems out there that affect our lives dramatically. That's no news to anybody. From voting machines to, software that works on census to software that works on healthcare. I mean, like really, code is it's transforming our lives, it's controlling our lives in many ways. And a lot of the code we don't have access to, but a digital citizen who can read the code in context and start to get a sense with the help of others of how this code operates and decisions that have been made and are being made and why they're being made, how their world is being modeled, both literally in the case of climate, how it's being modeled, but how just in general software models our world. Some of the assumptions that are being made along the way, the choices that are being made, the more of this I think that a person can access and understand, the better position they are to either resist or enter into the process or challenge or question. So, for me, like Freedom of Information Acts, part of the information we need access to is the code that's being used in some of these systems. So right now we're running an anti-racist critical code studies reading group, which you're all invited to join if you would like us, where a lot of those gathered here are looking at an anti-racist approach to the study of code. And one of the things we're trying to look at are something that people who study algorithms have talked about a lot, which are these predictive policing algorithms. And one of the problems is we don't have access to the code for them. So some researchers have reconstructed a simulation of the way Predpol, one of the big software tools, operates. And that's one of the things we're looking at in the working group to try to get a better understanding of whether there is, whether discrimination, whether racial bias is built into this software, or if it's, as they say in South Pacific, if it's being carefully taught, right? And then we have another piece of software called Civic Space, which we're also going to look at to understand the way it works. Now, a lot of people will say, will shy away a little bit from studying anything that involves machine learning or AI, because they say, well, this is, as Wendy Chun once said, this is code that's being written by other code. But, in as much as we have access to the code that's doing that writing, and we can understand those systems with the help of other people, I feel like there's a possibility for us, at least maybe the intervention is something like this. Maybe it's not, aha, I've caught you, government. I found the line of code that's controlling my life and making, that's creating inequity. Maybe that's not what happens. But maybe it's a moment where you're having the interdisciplinary course that's where students from lots of disciplines and faculty members are looking at the code together from this anti-racist point of view, or whatever one you want to use. And they're saying, let's slow the roll a little bit and let's consider some of the assumptions that are being made here in the development of the software and how it might be negatively impacting our society. So that just raises the opportunity for an intervention that happens there that hopefully will influence code that's written later on.
That's great. Thanks, Mark. And this kind of follows on the heels in terms of the politics of code or code reading. Pam, but also Brianne and Daniel are interested in hearing you speak to the efforts to queer the code. Pam writes, i.e. to break the binary of code so that code is no longer at its core a series of zeros and ones.
Yeah.
speak to that?
Yeah,
And style?
there's some fantastic projects that are working in that direction. Of course, one of my favorites was one I wrote on early on. That was the Transcoder, an art project developed by artist Zach Blass, where he created his own, pseudocode or theoretical programming language that was built out of queer theory in ways that are, if you haven't looked at this project, you should. It's beautiful and brilliant, and it resists. It is intentionally something that's not it doesn't create, it's not a Turing compliant language, but is something that is more artistic intervention into the realm, as something that cannot be processed in order to disrupt assumptions. So that was a beautiful project. And of course, since then there have been many other projects, including some by those who are gathered here. So anyway.
Awesome. Sorry, I was just typing that into the chat. Anna wants to ask about the performative, aspects, performative and executable nature of code versus cryptograms, and wants to know if there's a deeper difference in how both give us insight into what kinds of thinking go into thinking with and even about symbols. So she's asking about performative versus representative in general terms.
Yeah, well, I feel like I'd love to hear what Anna had to say about that, but from my point of view, that speaks a little bit to the fact that even though I'm talking about code in this session almost entirely in terms of a static representation of symbols that can be interpreted and analyzed, other scholars, especially someone like Evan Buswell, have thought about the fact that you always have to think about code and its state as it's being processed on whatever platform it's operating on. And so if we think about, I guess if you always bring that dimension in, and we don't think about code solely as the remnant of the process, the static remnant of the process, or the static instigator of the process, but something that's transforming while it's being processed, and something that's dynamic. And again, I guess another way to think about it is gets performed by and with the machine, then it becomes something that we're going to interpret in different ways than we would something like a cryptogram. I don't know if that helps.
Yeah, this is wonderful. I'm loving these questions and your answers to them. We'll take maybe one or two more. So if you do have a question, please type it in. I'm really loving. Oh, here's my new colleague Diana Leong. Mark,
Diana.
Hopefully we're going to be on an ELO panel.
I know. Nice to see you in person.
Great. You can see her. She's a brilliant scholar of eco theory. Wait, where'd it go? Okay, Diana. She wants to know, what would you say are, talking about ClimateGate, eco-criticism, what would you say are the ethical environmental obligations for code studies? Thinking about the material apparatuses that support it.
Oh, yeah.
Hardware, right. Is that what you mean, Diana? The kind of material, yeah, that's nice.
Yeah, I mean, I think that to some extent, one of the things we can do is celebrate efforts that people have made. And so, for example, last working group, we were looking at code from a code artist who, Eugenio Tiselli, who made a piece called Amazon, which is a beautiful piece that he released in miniature through Twitter to have other people implement. And this is just a tiny little code piece. And Jessica, I'm not sure if it's, well, you know what? Let me see if I can, it might take me to.
Tell me again and I'll go look for it.
It's Amazon by Eugenio Tiselli. I don't know if you can find it, but well, I'll talk about it while you're looking for it. And somebody else might find it even faster. But this is a piece that does a representation of the Amazon, but just using little ASCII characters. And then those ASCII characters are being transformed into digits, one at a time. It happens on the web page. Now, this is it's a tiny little program that has been minimized. Now, I have to tell you this thing. Eugenio Tiselli is someone who left making digital art because he was conscious of just the sheer environmental burden that his projects were placing on the world. For a while, he left. And then he returned. And when he returned, he was making projects like this, projects that take up, again, it was small code that he later minified. So this is like as small a footprint as you can make. And then he's distributing it in sort of the lightest form he can, although, putting it out over Twitter, arguably, you think about how many resources that takes, I guess. But I think one of the things that critical code studies can do is it can sort of celebrate those kinds of choices, even though, of course, minifying it, on one hand made that code harder to read, but you could always expand it. In the case of ClimateGate in the book, the intervention I try to make is to show obviously that example from the book. In the case, if anybody hasn't read the book, the ClimateGate case was code that seemed to be meant to do some modeling of climate change from this lab in East Anglia had been leaked or had been exposed to the world. And people found this thing, a fudge factor in the code that they thought was, artificially manufacturing climate change in the code. They kept using this term, the smoking gun. We found the smoking gun. Okay, great. Well, it turns out, if you read the spoiler alert, anyway, it turns out that it's not really a spoiler. I think I mentioned even the intro. It turns out that that's not what that code was doing. The code was just making an adjustment to sometimes we have to bring data sets into, bring them into coherence with each other so that we can graph things out. And what they were doing was graphing something for a presentation, and they did have a fudge factor that they were using until the time that they had a chance to go ahead and reconcile these two data sets. So not all that interesting. Actually like quite banal as it turns out. But the discussion of this code was, explosive. It was the type of stuff you're going to see on like cable news, and it's like, oh, we got them here, right? Anyway, what I do in the book is just sort of talk about the way in which code has become the object of political discourse, as that case makes clear, and that really a lot of the work that was needed was people to go in and just explain the way that code worked and its context fully. So it's like, maybe that chapter is also like a call for us to be a little more responsible in our, to intervene on the level of anthropology, archaeology, right? On some level as a political act, just to make sure that people aren't just making up whatever code does, which is another means of manipulation.
Well, we are, there's one question, hopefully it's a short answer because I don't want to take us too over time, but there's a few questions about how to integrate this into curriculum, Mark. And I know you think a lot about that as a professor of writing and teaching of writing. Like the question is, how would this be integrated? How could critical code studies be integrated into graduate school or even, I don't know, even undergraduate school curriculum? Have you thought about that? What would you think?
Yeah, just in case you decide to get it, the last section of the book is all about this. So in my dream world, we could bring it in on various levels. One, I would love to see more interdisciplinary courses, right, that have humanities majors and those studying computer science. Again, not to recreate the Snow's two worlds notion, as Jeremy Douglas has warned me not to do, but just to bring those groups into conversation, and not to keep saying, hey, digital humanities folks, you need to learn how to program, but to say, hey, digital humanities folks, you have a skill set. Now come in conversation with folks who have that other skill set, and you can be in conversation with one another. And maybe you'll learn how to program in the process, and maybe you'll teach them how to interpret in the process. So I would love to see that. I think our literary classes, could easily incorporate some basic notions of programming, both in helping people think about the creation of digital art objects, but also in helping them to read them. And there's some that are written, you know, again, a great exercise that I have my students do is to read something like the Code of Taroko Gorge and its variants. Again, another shout out to Nick and crew. And then to have them experiment with it. I think it's a great way to learn how to program and a great way to learn how to read critically on this layer. And I do think, you know, obviously you could tell I've got this another agenda for critical code studies that has to do with a kind of social consciousness and an ethical consciousness, really, to be honest. And I a lot of those accrediting agencies that go out and look at programs, look at whether their engineering programs have ethics components. And I do think that possibly the critical code studies may have something to offer when it comes to teaching computer science, teaching programming in a way that has this social or ethical dimension to it. So I mean, I don't know if it does. I would hope it would inspire that, though.
Well, Mark, this has been wonderful. The chat is just totally robust and fantastic. People, I mean, the talk's been so great that people want to set up a reading group and continue the conversation. So I think that says something to your work and your spirit and your answers. But before we thank you, I want to plug 2 upcoming events. One is with Mark, which is, and first of all, the next book talk is actually Noah Wardrop-Fruin, also MIT Press author, also former DISC group member with Mark and me. Speaking, do you have the book right there? Oh.
I do. I was pulling this down,
okay,
but yes, of course. I have Noah's book right here.
So sign up, here it is. You can sign up to join us again to continue the conversation with Noah on his book about games and how Pac-Man eats. And also before that, Mark, Noah, and Jeremy Douglas and I, who were in a dissertation writing group a long time ago, are meeting to talk about the importance of collaboration and writing groups. And Bree Hawkins, who is on here somewhere and is a grad student in the English department at SDSU, will be joining us and be one of the responders. So
hey, but if you're plugging events, let me plug a few as well, which includes, you're all invited to on Friday of this week at noon. The Hacks Lab is hosting a book talk by somebody else you guys might know, for a book you may also know. So here we got Bookishness by Jessica Pressman. And then those of you involved in the Electronic Literature Organization might be able to also see a book launch on the first Friday in March by our very own code poet, Nick Montfort, who's going to be dropping by as well. So we have lots of great events coming up, and this is a terrific community. And I have been so grateful to you all for joining us for this and for listening for a little time on critical code studies. So thank you guys for coming. Please, it really means a lot to me. And it's wonderful to, and really, I do consider this the celebration that we never had for the launch of the book. So thank you for celebrating with me, because it really means a lot to me.
Thank you, Mark, for your time. And thank you all for joining and for having your video on when you could. It's really just so joyful to see your faces and hear your voices in the chat. So thank you all. I hope we get to meet in person soon. Take good care.
Bye.